Hello, welcome to this ICN training module on market definition and market power. My name is Richard Wish, Emeritus Professor of Law at King's College London, and I'm going to be co-presenting this module with my friends and colleagues Adrian Majumdar and Amelia Fletcher, and I will ask them to introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Adrian Majumdar. I'm a partner at RBB Economics, and in this module I'm going to talk about market definition, the concepts and the evidence.
I'm Amelia Fletcher. I'm Professor of Competition Policy at the University of East Anglia in the UK, and I'm going to be talking about market power and its assessment.
So let me explain to you how we're going to structure this module. I will begin with some introductory comments on the topics of market definition and market power. And then we will have a section in which we go into market definition in more detail. And we will ask the question, why do we define markets and how do we go about it? Adrian will take over from me and in particular introduce you to the key concept of substitutability. How can we know whether a customer is going to substitute from buying one product to buying another product, or from buying from in one area to buying in another area? And in particular, what kind of evidence might be useful in carrying out that process? We will then hear from Amelia Fletcher on the assessment of market power, the key concept at the heart of this module. After we've heard from Adrian and Amelia, I will then discuss some current issues in market definition, which are quite challenging, very topical, and which are being re-examined by the European Commission at the moment in its reassessment of its 1997 notice on market definition. And then there will be some discussion of some of these interesting topics, and then we will conclude with some final remarks. Competition law is primarily concerned with the question of whether harms may occur if a firm has or may have market power. And we look at this from various different perspectives. First of all, let's imagine that two or more firms enter into an agreement with one another. Will the fact of entering into that agreement give them joint market power? And might that be a problem in terms of competitive harm? Or we might look at the conduct of an individual firm. And we might think that a firm has so much market power that it's a monopolist. Or if not an actual monopolist, maybe it's dominant, or maybe it has substantial market power, so much so that we're concerned about the possible abuse of the market power that it has. And another way of thinking about market power is when we look at mergers, because if two or more firms are going to merge, it may be that post-merger they will have more market power than they did beforehand, and that might give rise to competitive concerns. So the question is, what do we mean by market power? And a definition of this is that a firm has market power if it is able profitably to sustain its prices above the competitive level. Now, when we talk about price in that situation, can I sustain my price at a higher level than the competitive one? There are, of course, other ways in which firms compete with one another. They might compete in terms of the amount of output they produce, or the quality of the products that they produce, or the ways in which they choose to innovate. And so when we use the expression here, price, in a sense it's a portmanteau word that includes these other parameters of competition. So we could say market power is the ability to sustain price profitably above competitive levels, or we could ask, could a firm profitably decrease its output below competitive levels? Or could it degrade the quality of the products that it would have to produce in competitive circumstances? So we are interested in the question of whether a firm has market power. But of course, market power doesn't exist in the abstract. Market power exists in relation to a market. Firms compete with one another in the marketplace, and in particular, they can compete with one another in relation to the products that they produce. Suppose I am a grower of apples. Other people grow pears and oranges. Do apples, pears, oranges compete with one another? Are they in the same product market? Similarly, I might grow my apples in the United Kingdom. Somebody else grows apples in France and another person in Germany. Do those people compete with me in the same geographical market? And another way of thinking about this is in terms of time. I might grow an apple that comes to ripeness early in autumn. Somebody else in the middle of autumn, somebody else later in autumn. Do these apples compete with one another in a temporal market? When we look at the work of competition authorities throughout the world, we see that in any particular case they are concerned with assessing whether a firm has or will have, after a merger for example, market power. But very often in conducting this assessment, the competition authority in question will define the relevant market, the product market, the geographic market, in some fairly unusual circumstances, the temporal market. So market definition is a feature of the work of competition authorities throughout the world. In the EU, as a matter of EU competition law, there's a legal requirement to define the relevant market. This goes all the way back to 1973, when the Court of Justice decided one of its first ever cases on Article 102 of the TFEU, what in those days was Article 86 of the EEC Treaty. And in that case, the European Commission had prohibited a merger whereby Continental Can had acquired one of its competitors in the marketplace. And the Commission's view was that this was going to eliminate nearly all competition in that market. On appeal to the Court of Justice, the court agreed that the conduct in question could be an abuse, but annulled the Commission's decision because it hadn't defined the relevant market. And what the Court of Justice said was, you can't decide that somebody is dominant without having first defined the relevant market in which that dominance was supposed to exist. And then subsequently, when the EU adopted a merger regulation, it used the same language as Article 102. Would the merger create or strengthen a dominant position? And a case came to the Court of Justice called France against the Commission, and the court said, well, you have to define a market for the purposes of Article 102 to decide if there's a dominant position, and in the same way, you have to define the market under the EU MR in order to decide whether the merger would create or strengthen a dominant position. So we know, therefore, that in EU law there is an obligation to define the relevant market. But we must emphasise, and we will do throughout this module, market definition is not an end in itself. It is simply one step in the way towards deciding whether a firm or firms have or will have market power. And later in this module, we will actually discuss the question of whether market definition, is it given too much emphasis in competition law? We will come to that towards the end of the module. So there are many circumstances in competition law in which we are going to define the relevant market. And so now we start to get more technical. How is this actually done in practice? Well, in the United States in 1992, the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission wrote some horizontal merger guidelines. And in those guidelines, it introduced the hypothetical monopolist test. And subsequently, in Europe, the European Commission introduced a notice on market definition in 1997, and it adopts the same conceptual approach to market definition. Subsequently, the hypothetical monopolist test has been used by competition authorities throughout the world. And it is particularly useful in the case of merger control, because in merger control we are asking the question, this is the condition of the market at the moment, these firms are going to merge. After the merger, will they have more market power than they do at the moment? And from there you go on to work out whether there's competitive harm in the case at hand. One should utter a word of caution about the hypothetical monopolist test. It's very useful in the case of merger control. One has to be somewhat more careful in the case of unilateral behaviour of dominant firms, where we come across the so-called cellophane fallacy. And this well-known problem of market definition is something that Adrian and Amelia will both talk about later in this module. So one way of applying the hypothetical monopolist test is to use what is sometimes referred to as the SNP test. This we will find, for example, in the European Commission's Notice on Market Definition of 1997. And what the SNP test does is to pose the following question. Suppose that I am the grower of apples and I apply a price increase to those apples, a small but significant, non-transitory increase in price, a SNP. What is a SNP? An increase in, say, 5 to 10% of the price of the apples. In that situation, would so many customers substitute away from buying apples to instead buying pears and oranges? Would so many customers do that as to make my price rise unprofitable? And we use this methodology in order to determine the breadth or the narrowness of the market definition. And Adrian is going to take over from me in a moment and explain how this is applied in practice, and in particular the kinds of evidence that might be used for the purposes of the SNP test. Of course, it's not always the case that people compete on price. They might compete on the quality of the products that they produce. So if that's the parameter of competition in which we're interested, there's no point in asking about a SNP, an increase in price. We might ask what would happen in the event of a decrease in quality. What if there were to be a small but significant, non-transitory decrease in the quality of products? Would that cause people to divert from the apples to the oranges?
I'm now going to talk about demand-side substitution. Markets tend to be defined on the demand side. We proceed as follows. We think about the focal product, that is the product that is the subject of the investigation. What we're interested in is what other products consumers or customers consider to be good alternatives to the focal product. And the way we answer that question is by thinking about how customers would react to a small but significant increase in the price of the focal product or an equivalent reduction in the quality of the focal product. An important point to remember is that not all consumers need to switch, just enough to render the price rise or the quality reduction unprofitable. That brings us to the concept of critical loss. The critical loss is the amount of volumes that has to be lost to just make a price rise or quality reduction unprofitable. And I'll give you an example in a minute of where the amount of switching is below the critical loss such that the price rise is profitable, or above the critical loss such that a price rise is unprofitable. The final point is where suppliers can price discriminate between customer groups, they may charge lower prices to customer segments that are more likely to switch and higher prices to customer groups that are less likely to switch. Where such prices can be sustained, we may have customer markets, where the market is defined by each customer segment. I'm now going to talk about the concept of critical loss. On the diagram, you see price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. A hypothetical firm, firm A, has profits which are shown by the brown box. These profits are the price less the cost per unit multiplied by the volume sold. When prices go up by 5 or 10%, firm A will lose some volumes. The amount lost is shown by the diverted demand. That leads to a loss in profit, which is the lost volumes multiplied by the margin that was generated on those volumes. So that's the amount of profit lost as a result of prices going up. However, because some consumers do not switch away, higher profit is earned on those consumers that remain with the firm. That additional profit is shown by the box marked higher margin. So for us to test whether overall this 5 to 10% price rise is profitable, we compare the size of the two boxes. And in this example, the higher margin box, i.e. the amount of profit or the amount of extra profit generated from the customers that did not switch away, is greater than the amount of profit lost from those customers that did switch away. So in this example, the 5 to 10% price rise is profitable. We're going to show a counter example, that is where a similar price rise is unprofitable. So as before, we have price and quantity on the vertical and horizontal axes, and firm A's profit is, as before, shown by the brown box. This time, when it increases price, the quantity reduction is much greater than before, and as a result, the lost profit is larger than before, and the additional profit gained on retained customers is smaller than before. So then, when we compare the size of the two boxes, we see that the lost profit from the diverted demand exceeds the additional profit gained on retained customers. So here's an example where the 5 to 10% price rise is not profitable. Now I'm going to talk about a hypothetical example that explains how the SNP test works in practice. Imagine there is a monopoly supplier of fizzy orange drinks. What we do is we imagine prices of fizzy orange going up by 5 to 10%, and we ask the question, is that profitable? If not, we need to understand which products consumers switch to as a result of the price rise. We then add into the candidate market the product to which most consumers switch. So for sake of argument, let's suppose that that's cola flavoured drinks. Then we repeat the test now with this broader candidate market of fizzy orange and cola flavoured drinks. We ask the same question again. Could a hypothetical monopolist of fizzy orange and cola flavoured drinks profitably sustain prices by 5 to 10% above competitive levels? If so, we have a relevant market. If not, we have to add in the next best substitute to fizzy orange. In order to conduct that test, we would ideally have evidence on switching patterns. So in this slide, I present some hypothetical switching patterns following a 10% price increase in the price of fizzy orange. Let's suppose that price increase leads to 100 volumes being switched away. Of those volumes, 40 are switched to cola flavoured drinks, 25 to lemonade flavoured drinks, 10 to energy drinks, and 5 to water drinks. In the previous example, I explained that when conducting the hypothetical monopolist test, if the price of fizzy orange went up by 5 to 10% and that was not profitable, we would then widen the market to include the first best substitute to fizzy orange. That was cola flavoured drinks. And if increasing prices by 5 to 10% on that broader market was not profitable, we would add back the second closest substitute to fizzy orange, which in this example are lemonade drinks, and so on. It's therefore helpful, ideally, to have a sense of which are the closest substitutes to the focal product. What this diagram here shows is the results of the switching exercise discussed on the previous slide. So what we found was 40% of lost volumes went to cola flavoured drinks, 25% to lemonade flavoured drinks, 10% to energy drinks, 5% to fizzy water, and 20% are switched to other drinks or no drink at all. This concept of how switching is distributed amongst substitute products is linked to the diversion ratio. The diversion ratio captures the percentage of lost volumes that go to any particular product. So for example, following a small increase in the price of fizzy orange, if 100 units are lost, 40 of which go to cola flavoured drinks, the diversion ratio from fizzy orange to cola is 40%. That's a useful concept to rank the closeness of substitutes to focal products. Now, the previous example of conducting the hypothetical monopolist test was purely hypothetical. And the great thing about hypothetical examples is that you can assume that you have all the information you need to conduct the test. Of course, in reality, we need to go and gather evidence on substitution patterns to apply the test in practice. So what I'm going to talk about now are various pieces of evidence that allow you to assess closeness of substitution and conduct the hypothetical monopolist test in practice. Actual evidence on switching behaviour may be available from a number of sources. In some situations, when looking at a fast-moving consumer good, for example, it may be that there's evidence from supermarkets discounting that product, and we can see how consumers react to that change in price. Other times, maybe a product is out of stock, and we can see which products consumers purchase instead. Sometimes companies survey households and observe their expenditure over time, and that allows you to understand household switching patterns in response to price changes or just generally over time. A useful source of evidence is asking customers whether they switched in the past, and if so, what products did they switch from, and what was the new product that they purchased. So that history of switching behaviour can be an extremely useful piece of evidence to gather. This brings us to the issue of survey evidence. It can be very helpful to ask consumers how they would react to price changes. For example, we can ask how consumers would react to prices going up by 5 or 10%. Would they continue to purchase the product, or would they switch to an alternative? And if so, which alternative would they switch to? One point to note though, because the questions are hypothetical, we can't necessarily be confident that consumers would do what they say they would do. One possible way around this is to ask consumers what they have done in the past. We can ask consumers, have they switched in the past? If so, who was their original supplier and which supplier did they switch to? And why did that switching occur? What was the reason? Was it a price increase, a quality reduction, or some other factor? A final point to note with survey evidence is that ideally we would have a large and representative sample. Where there are differences, we would also want to know whether they are statistically significant. That is to say, not determined purely by chance, and the survey company should be able to report that information. A final point to watch is that how questions are framed can really matter. So questions should not be designed in a way that leads the consumer to give a particular answer. Where firms generate the majority of their turnover from tenders, it can be informative to understand which suppliers they regularly compete against during the tender process. It can be also useful to understand how much switching occurs. For example, do customers typically switch when they re-tender? Another important piece of information can be the suppliers to which the firm of interest regularly loses. That can be important information to understand closeness of competition, for example. Finally, a related point is that sometimes firms collect information on where their customers go when they leave. For example, they conduct exit surveys and they get in touch with customers that have switched away and say, why did you leave? And can you please tell us which supplier you went to instead? So that sort of information can be particularly useful for understanding competitive constraints on the firm in question. Now we're going to talk about entry events and how they may generate useful information for defining relevant markets. Suppose there is a retail chain, for example a chain of supermarkets, and suppose that there are many stores and each of these stores have experienced some form of entry against them. So we have a large data set of entry against the incumbent supermarket stores. What we can do is we can observe how close a similar store needs to be before it has an impact on the incumbent store's turnover. That allows us to shed light on the geographic market definition. We can also test the impact of entry by other types of stores. For example, a discount store or a store that focuses on premium customers to see if, when they enter nearby, they also have a material impact on turnover. If so, they may be in the relevant market. If not, they're less likely to be in the relevant market. So on this slide, we present a hypothetical example. On the vertical axis, we show the percentage reduction in an incumbent store turnover when another supermarket enters nearby. On the horizontal axis, we show how close the entry occurs. So here we show 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes drive time distance away. The crosses show the relationship between how close entry is and the impact on the incumbent store's turnover. So for example, when entry is around 5 minutes away, the impact is to reduce turnover by between 4 and 7%. On the other hand, when entry is 20 minutes or further away, there's relatively limited impact on the incumbent store's turnover. That suggests that the impact wears off after about 15 to 20 minutes, which might lead us to define the relevant geographic market to be 15 minutes drive time of the incumbent store. Now let's think of a related but different example. Suppose we're also interested in understanding the extent to which a different type of store may be in the same relevant market. For example, a discounter store or a store that focuses on premium customers. That's shown by the red circles on the diagram here. And what we see is even when entry occurs very close to the incumbent store, there really is a very limited impact on that store's turnover. So that would suggest that the new entrant in this case is not in the same relevant market, which sheds light on the relevant product market definition. So the previous slide showed how evidence on entry can help define the geographic market. Another way to define the geographic market is via catchment area analysis. On this diagram, imagine that we have a supermarket in the centre of a particular town. That's shown by the trolley. Imagine also that we have information on where the customers come from when they go to that supermarket. That, for example, could be from loyalty card information. What we may then do is ask the question, what is the core catchment area? The smallest area within which the supermarket gathers 80% of its customers or 80% of its spend. That catchment area may then be a useful proxy for the relevant geographic market. The same principle can be applied to suppliers that deliver their product as opposed to customers that come and pick it up from a store. So in this example, we have a factory that delivers an input to other customers. We can ask the same question. What is the smallest area within which that factory generates 80% of its turnover? That we can describe as the factory's core catchment area. But a couple of points are worth noting here. First of all, I've talked about 80% as a way to establish the core catchment area. The idea is 80% captures the large majority of custom, but excludes special cases which may arise for unusual means and therefore should be excluded from the core catchment area. But there's no magic number. It doesn't have to be 80%, it could be 70% or 90%. It really depends on the situation. So we do need to sensitivity test to see whether results vary substantially using different percentages. A final and important point to note is that if prices go up by 5 to 10%, that may make it more attractive for customers to travel further or for the factory to deliver further away from its location. So a catchment area doesn't necessarily give you a market defined by the hypothetical monopolist test, rather it's just one way of understanding the geographic market within which most of a supplier's competition takes place. Now we're going to talk about supply side substitution. If prices go up by 5 or 10%, it may be that suppliers not currently producing a particular product would do so quickly and without substantial sunk investment. That is to say, enter the market very rapidly, bringing their capacity to the market. This is more likely to occur where the firms already have the necessary production technology to produce the good in question. For example, where the same capacity produces different grades or different sizes or different qualities, it may be that the ability to produce one grade or one size or one quality implies the ability to produce the full range. So for example, on the demand side, size 39 shoes are not in the same market as size 45 shoes. However, on the supply side, the ability to produce size 39 shoes implies the ability to produce size 45 shoes and vice versa. Similarly, with grades of paper, the ability to produce one grade of paper implies the ability to produce many grades of paper, even if on the demand side those grades are used for different purposes. Outside of these examples, supply side substitution might not be used to broaden the market or to expand the market size. However, it doesn't mean that we don't take into account supply side factors. We take them into account as part of the assessment of market power, and Amelia will be speaking about this issue shortly.
So Adrian, we've been talking about market definition, how you define a market, the evidence that one can use, and we've talked a lot about the SNP test and increases in price, and often maybe very good pricing information available, but not always, quite clearly. And so the question then arises, what other bits of evidence can be used in the process of market definition? And I thought what I would do is to ask you about different types of evidence and give me short bullet point answers to whether the following types of evidence are useful or not. Now, we know that sometimes the competition authority will say, rather than looking at price, or in addition to looking at price, let's look at the characteristics of a product. So tell me, when's that a useful thing to do?
Well, it's useful when the characteristics that you focus on are the key characteristics that drive consumer choice. So, for example, if consumers care about characteristics A, B and C, but don't care about characteristics D to Z, then identifying products that offer a good ABC characteristic base, if you like, is going to be helpful in defining the market, and it would be much less relevant to look at products which, for example, offer X, Y and Z.
Yes. Okay, very good, thank you. Now then, another thought is that the market is awash with data about markets and consumer demand and so on and so forth, or alternatively a competition authority could commission a report, or the parties could commission a survey What are the pros and cons of reports and survey evidence?
So the pros are with reports that data are available. The cons are that they are not necessarily gathered in a way that necessarily answers the hypothetical monopolist test question. So for example, third-party reports may be useful for market sizing, however they may not generate information on exactly the market that would be defined by a hypothetical monopolist test, and so you'd need to potentially come up with assumptions to resize those markets. Yes. Commissioned reports can be very useful, but again it depends on the purpose of the report. If it was commissioned to define a market, very useful. If it was commissioned for some other purpose, then that context needs to be accounted for to decide how much weight sensibly can be placed on the report for the purpose of market definition.
Very good. Now, another thing, we often see in competition decisions that maybe a competition authority is trying to define a market, or maybe scrutinising conduct, and it says, we have found these internal documents, and the internal documents tell us that ... Or we sometimes hear that a company has said, our aim is to be the market leader, or the world leader. Public statements. How much relevance should we give to these kind of statements?
Yeah. You're absolutely right to raise this point, and my experience is that competition authorities certainly do place a lot of weight on such documents. Again, context is key. I mean, if one finds that systematically a firm refers to the same set of competitors in the context of who are the most important constraints on pricing or quality setting behaviour, then that is really useful evidence defining the relevant market and the relevant competitor set. On the other hand, some documents may be generated in a different context that's much less relevant, and so we need to weight them accordingly.
Yes.
Public statements, we want to be the market leader. Well, you would expect firms to say that, and so again, maybe again, it's context specific, but perhaps
yes, indeed,
weigh them in due context.
Use one's common sense,
absolutely,
I think, is the answer.
Yeah.
And then, the SNP test, the hypothetical monopolist test, we're talking about whether people substitute from the widgets to the blodgets, and perhaps from the blodgets to the widgets, so we're looking at diversions there. But equally, there are some markets where, over a period of time, there's just simply a migration away from, the old widget to the new blodget. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that has arisen as the online market has grown, and some competition authorities will have received submissions that say the internet constrains brick and mortar sites because there's been a migration over time from brick and mortar purchases to online purchases. And I think what many competition authorities would say there is that is a different exercise than conducting a hypothetical monopolist test. Slow migration over time is different from the question of if prices of brick and mortar products go up today by 5 or 10%, would there be quick switching from brick and mortar to online purchases such that that price rise would be unprofitable? And that's the difference between what you might call switching or diversion for the hypothetical monopolist test versus a slower degree of migration over time.
Yes, understood. Now, those are some pros and cons of different types of evidence. Let's move on to a few other issues. The question of the uniqueness of a market definition. So a competition authority is doing a case, and in that case they have said that we've done our evidential survey and that widgets and blodgets are in the same relevant market. Now, what is the status of a finding like that? Is it unique to that case? Does it have relevance in other cases?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, are market definitions unique? And the answer to that is no, they're not unique, in the sense that it really depends where you start. So if we take your example, let's suppose there was a prior case where the product of interest was widgets, and we found that if the price of widgets went up, there would be enough switching to blodgets that the price rise would be unprofitable, but you could hypothetically monopolise widgets and blodgets. In another case, we may start at blodgets, and for sake of argument, you might find that when you start at blodgets, the relevant market is blodgets, widgets and gadgets, because consumers switch not only to widgets but also gadgets when the price of blodgets go up. And so there you would have non-unique market definitions. The point being, it depends where you start this process. What is the focal product where you start the SNP process?
And I think there's a lesson here, is there not, for competition authorities, because it's totally understandable that an authority in country X will look at cases on widgets elsewhere in the world, and they might find very interesting discussion of market definitions, but they must accept that it's an interesting discussion, but it does not necessarily read across to whatever that authority is looking at that moment in time.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to say a little bit here about our favourite topic, the cellophane fallacy?
Yeah, well,
this is a well-known issue in competition analysis.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's an important concept to understand. So this is the idea that where a firm already has market power, they are likely to have exercised it. Therefore, increasing prices beyond the current or the prevailing levels may not be profitable simply because market power has already been exercised. So to give an example, suppose we have a hypothetical monopolist of buses, and that monopolist has increased the price of buses such that taxi services look as if they're a really good substitute. Why is that? It's simply because buses are so expensive. Had buses been competitively supplied, or bus services been competitively supplied, it may be that a 5 to 10% price rise would not cause switching to taxis. And so the takeaway point there is that one needs to place weight on switching evidence, or less weight if we think there's a chance that switching is occurring at levels above the competitive levels.
Yes.
I mean, again, it's going to depend on the situation that we're looking at. Are we using the hypothetical monopolist test to understand the existence of market power, or are we asking the question, would further price rises be likely following the horizontal?
So one has to be
merger?
very careful in that particular situation. Adrian, a few further points just to finish off this section. There is this phenomenon of asymmetric switching. That is to say, the classic example is you switch from apples to pears and pears to apples, but of course it doesn't always work like that, does it?
That's exactly right. So a good example might be that a large supermarket constrains a small supermarket, but the reverse may not be true. So you can have constraints going in one direction, but not the other, and ultimately the evidence is something that will decide that point.
So again, absolutely, so many things, in the end, it is empirical. It's about looking at the evidence to find out what the situation is. And then one last thought, it does strike me how often, for example, when I read European Commission decisions under the merger regulation, and we have to remember that there are over 10,000 notifications to the Commission now, and in all of those cases the Commission is looking at many possible market definitions. But quite often it says at the end of a decision, we have decided not to define the relevant market in this case, or relevant markets in this case, because it seems to us that however we do it, we will still end up saying there's no significant impediment to effective competition. I mean, that's an observation of mine. I don't know whether you want to add anything to it, or you might just simply say, I agree, I don't know, but what thoughts?
Well, I agree, Richard. I mean, put simply, if there's no issue under any relevant market definition, there is no need for the authorities to decide.
And it may actually be convenient for the authority not to decide, but also from the party's point of view, they might prefer not to have a decision in that particular case, and then in the future there's another case while you look at the facts afresh and define the market in that case.
Yeah, I mean, that's a key point as well, looking at the facts afresh and also being aware that markets evolve over time, absolutely. Yeah.
Sometimes quite rapidly.
Indeed.
Indeed. Okay, Adrian, thank you very much. So in the course of this module, we've heard a lot about the SNP test, the hypothetical monopolist test, the Commission's notice on market definition of 1997, but of course that's a long time ago now. And since 1997, a lot more has been learned about market definition. The European Commission has decided literally thousands and thousands of cases in which markets have had to be defined. There have been numerous cases that have gone to the General Court and the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, in which those courts have opined on aspects of market definition. And also, we've learned a lot about different types of markets, in which particular problems, particular issues of market definition have been examined. And so as a result of this, the European Commission has decided that it's time to reevaluate the 1997 notice. It has gone out to consultation, it's received numerous representations, and the plan is that in the course of 2022, a new notice on market definition will be adopted. So if we think about a future iteration of the Commission's notice on market definition, what kind of issues might it helpfully discuss? Well, to give an obvious one, there's the rise of so-called free products. When we use a search engine, when we join a social media group, we don't spend cash in order to make the search or to join the group. So how can you define a market by reference to a SNP? Because a 5 to 10% increase in zero is zero. So apparently the SNP test has no application in that situation. So how do we deal with that? What about so-called two-sided and multi-sided markets, which we've heard about? These have increased in number in recent years, in particular because of the rise of digital platforms. But how do you define markets when you're dealing with something which is two-sided or multi-sided? Very interesting question is so-called ecosystems, where one thinks of, for example, a range of products that might consist of hardware, software, a range of different services. I might be talking here about smartphones, for example, or operating systems and their associated products. When one looks at a case involving, for example, Google or Apple, does one go about market definition in a conventional way, starting with a possible narrow market definition and broadening it? Do we run cases on the basis that there's the X market and leveraging from the X market into the Y market? Or on the other hand, should one stand back and take a rather more panoramic view of what's happening and say, well, really, the competition exists between appliances that run on iOS, the Apple operating system, and appliances that run on Android, which is supplied by Google. In other words, is there competition between ecosystems? It's a quite different way of thinking about market definition than the traditional one. And a lot of thought is being given at this very moment to the question of market definition and ecosystems. Two other issues of interest are so-called innovation markets. In Europe, the European Commission in recent times has been concerned, for example, about mergers that might lead to a reduction in innovation, for example, between pharmaceutical companies or companies that produce sophisticated chemicals, where there might be overlaps between existing products. There might be overlaps between pipeline products that have yet to come to the market, but there might also be overlaps in the upstream R&D, the research and development that those companies are doing. Is there a market for innovation which is separate from the actual physical products that emerge at the end of the R&D process? And another very interesting issue, I think particularly in recent times as markets have become more globalized, we have a quite different trading environment from 25 or 30 years ago. What implications does this have for geographical market definition, where plausibly firms are not competing on a national or an EU or a European market. They might literally be competing on a global market. And how do we go about thinking of whether the market is global or less than global? These are all very interesting, quite complicated issues, and Adrian and I will be talking about some of these issues in an interview style later in this module. So Adrian, I mean, between the three of us, we've introduced the ideas of market definition, market power, and we've given quite a lot of detail as to how to go about these various processes. But we have emphasised all the way through that, ultimately it's market power that is the really important thing. And I said in an earlier slide that there is a debate. I mean, is there too much emphasis on market definition in competition law cases, would you say?
Well, it's a good question, Richard. I think that debate has really come up in mergers. So let me just start by saying when we're thinking about dominance or the existence of substantial market power, market definition is really important for that exercise. Turning to horizontal mergers, there is a debate that says what we're really interested in is whether the merger creates or enhances market power, and maybe a direct way of looking at the impact of a horizontal merger is to look at the closeness of competition between the two merging parties. And so there is, some people would argue that's where the focus should be as opposed to market definition. However, those who would argue against going too far in that direction would say, firstly, as you mentioned earlier on, Richard, market definition is useful as a framework for, if you like, setting the scene, understanding how market shares move over time, giving us a concept of a market so we can think about entry into that market, and indeed understanding who the relevant buyers are. And that context is important because if we're looking at, for example, a substantial lessening of competition, that may mean that a substantial number of these buyers are affected, not just one or two, and the market can be quite important in understanding that context.
Yes. No, that's very interesting. And of course, I mean, you mentioned mergers in particular there, and it's very interesting in the United Kingdom, where our Competition and Markets Authority this year published new substantive guidelines on merger control. And I think one could say that they have, what shall I say, de-emphasised market definition. It's sort of a chapter of its own at the end of the document. It's not up front, it's not the beginning of the exercise, it's part of the overall competitive assessment in the case.
Yeah, that's fair to say, and I think if you speak to the CMA officials, they would say that that's putting on paper what they have been doing in the past few years.
Yes.
That said, I'd emphasise, as I said before, market definition still is an important part of the process of identifying market power. Indeed.
Okay, now let's move on to a recent slide I was showing when I was mentioning that there are a number of interesting issues in market definition today, and one of them was this phenomenon of the free product. One always has to put this in inverted commas, but the free product. You can't apply a snip test, a hypothetical increase in price of 10% to a price of 0. So how does one go about this phenomenon of the free market?
Well, I think it's really very much as you described earlier on, Richard, and if we apply this thought experiment, the hypothetical monopolist test doesn't have to be implemented necessarily by thinking about prices going up. We can also think about a small but significant non-transitory decrease in quality. So what happens if the quality of the free good goes down? Do sufficient consumers switch away to make that quality reduction unprofitable?
In other words, we shouldn't obsess with the snip, the P in snip. There are other parameters of competition. That is the point that you're making.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. And then a similar amount of debate is had around so-called two-sided and multi-sided markets. And what always slightly amuses me about this is, of course, that there's nothing new in this world about a two-sided market. I mean, 50 years ago, newspapers had readers and advertisers. On the other hand, we are exposed to it much more today because of the rise of digital platforms and numerous intermediation services, etc., where you have complementary groups of people using the intermediation service. Is there a simple answer to the problem of two-sided and multi-sided markets?
I think, well, the way I like to think about it is, let's just break it down and take it step by step. So, for example, let's suppose we have a platform and it's one where buyers meet sellers. So it's a transactional platform where certain fashion goods are for sale, for example. To my mind, what we can do is we can ask the question, what are the options for buyers using that platform? If the platform quality went down, for sake of argument, would they switch away to alternative platforms, or would they switch away to alternative online or even offline sources of supply? So we understand one side of the market's options. Then we turn to the other side and ask the same question again. So the sellers, what are their options if they, for some reason, are charged higher fees on the platform, or if the quality of the platform tools go down? Do they switch to other platforms? Do they have alternative sources of selling online or indeed offline? So I don't think we necessarily say it's a platform, therefore all the other competitors must necessarily be other platforms. And I think the final point is, with these transactional platforms, there are so-called cross-network effects, which is the idea that if the quality of one side goes down, users on the other side find or rather, if the number of buyers on the platform goes down, then sellers find the platform less attractive, and vice versa. And if those cross-network effects are important, then we need to take that into account, whether when we're defining the market or just more generally when we're assessing competitive effects.
And so, I mean, it means, of course, there is no simple answer to the problem of two-sided and multi-sided markets, and we always have to remind ourselves that different platforms do very different things, and the business models are different and so on. So one might get quite different outcomes from case A to case B. So, Adrian, moving on from multi-sided markets, we can now come to the interesting topical question of ecosystems. Now, of course, the idea of systems markets in competition law isn't new. I mean, 25 years ago, we were asking whether a printer and a cartridge were in one market or two markets, etc. But this phenomenon is encountered far more today in the digital world, where you have families of products. It can be hardware and software and services and so on and so forth. And the question becomes, can you define markets in the, if you like, traditional way, starting with a narrow market and building? Or do you say, there's a family of Google products, and broadly speaking, they compete with a family of Apple products? And so, I suppose the question is, does one have to think about market definition in a quite different way in this world?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I mean, let's take a step back and first of all say, what is an ecosystem? And an ecosystem in a digital market would capture where the consumer enters the system, so what device are they using and what data is generated when they enter the system. There's then typically a core service, and around that service there will be complementary products as well. So all of that is the ecosystem. If we think about the hypothetical monopolist test, that is better suited to a question such as, well, look, if the quality of an app went down, would there be substantial switching to another app? Or if the core service was of a lower quality, would there be switching to another core service? That's the hypothetical monopolist test is probably better suited to those questions, but sometimes for understanding competition, it makes more sense to think about competing systems, in which case adopting a system approach may be a better way to go. It really is going to depend on the case in hand.
And this is under review, and the European Commission, as part of its review of its 1997 notice, I know that's one of the issues that they're looking at. And in the United Kingdom, the Competition and Markets Authority is doing a market study on the question of ecosystems, because we have to understand this phenomenon better. Okay, now my slide mentioned another issue of market definition, which is innovation markets. And this has become significant in recent years in particular, I think, where the Commission says you can have a product market, you can have a product pipeline product market, but we can also have upstream competition as well. But then that raises the question, how do you define an innovation market? And do you look for market shares of an innovation market? It becomes rather speculative, if I can use that term in a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. And because you're looking so far ahead and talking about the creation of products yet to be created, then I think necessarily it does have that element of speculation that you mentioned. I think it's very difficult, and I think we have to go back to what is the question that we're trying to answer. So, for example, if the issue is who are the competitors that are likely to be innovating in a given innovation track, then query, do we necessarily have to define the market as such, or is it more important just to identify the types of players that are most likely going to be innovating in a certain direction? And in that sense, maybe the traditional idea of a market and market shares is less useful compared to understanding who are the key players innovating along this particular dimension.
Yes, indeed, thank you. And then one final thought about market definition, I think, because again, the European Commission's been looking at this, and we had the merger a few years ago, or the prospective merger between Siemens and Alstom, which was prohibited on competition grounds by the Commission. And some people said, oh, the Commission got this wrong because they failed to define the geographical market as being the whole of the world or a significant part of the world, and that maybe in the kind of economy we live in today, does geographical market definition have to be rethought? Should the Commission be more open, perhaps, to defining global markets rather than European markets?
I don't think the concepts need to be rethought. So we've talked about the hypothetical monopolist test and the idea that prices go up or quality goes down in a given area, and the question is the extent to which consumers would substitute to alternative areas. To my mind, that question or that process remains the same. If it is the case that globalisation has lowered trade barriers and made it easier for consumers to purchase further afield, then that will be picked up by asking that question.
And in fact, one can think of cases where the European Commission has defined a global market. It's just that empirically on the facts of Siemens Alstom, they decided that was not correct at that point in time. Thank you very much.